Good to go.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Lizzie Barkay. I'm a graduate student at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and I work with Dr. Hardin Coleman at the Center for Character and Social Responsibility. Today, I'll be introducing Dr. Hardin Coleman and Karen Corbett Sanders to you to talk about what was lost and what was recovered related to social emotional learning during the pandemic. So I'll let Karen and Hardin introduce themselves to you now. Go ahead.
Lizzie, thank you so much. And it is such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Karen Corbett Sanders, and I am an accidental educator. I come to this work as somebody experienced in international business, but have a passion for ensuring that every child is able to reach their potential in the schools in Fairfax County. And so I have the honor of representing Fairfax County, the Mount Vernon Magisterial District on the Fairfax County School Board, as well as I have the pleasure and honor of working with Dr. Coleman as part of the Dean's Advisory Board at Boston University's Wheelock School of Education and Human Development.
And my name's Hardin Coleman. I'm a professor at Boston University, and I think of in the context of my family, I'm a third generation. Coleman has really been focusing on how to bring into reality the promise of our Declaration of Independence about all people being created equal and able to pursuit of happiness. And there are a lot of issues there. Part of them are legal, part of them are educational, and a lot of my work is around how we can prepare both students to children to take a flourish in the world, and educators to facilitate that process. And that's a lot of the conversations that we're engaged in today.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Hardin, will you go ahead and let us know what the goals are of your presentation today?
Great. You know, we just went through one of these rare international pandemics that's shared in all corners of the world, that was inescapable and traumatic for us all. And the issue that adults being out of control, not knowing what's going to happen next, the fear that invaded is something that we have to think about and both recover from, but also prepare for how this may be. How we can be better prepared when something like this comes again. So our conversation is really about the focus on the social emotional learning loss as a function of the pandemic. We know about the learning loss, and we have good structures in place to try to address those issues. But it's really the social emotional loss and the issues that come up and the data that we're beginning to learn, which Karen's going to share more specifically with us later, is really how do we respond to that, and how do we help our children overcome the trauma and also prepare for them for the next stage of their lives. So we're going to address the issue in the United States that we don't have a systematic approach to the recovery from social emotional learning loss. And we want to have Karen give us a case example of a district's attempt to address that social emotional learning loss, and then suggest a way to take the model that she's going to share with us to scale.
Well, before we move on,
Karen?
can I just jump in there a little bit, because
Sure.
you inspired me to say something when your introductory remarks were about how we have a pursuit of happiness in our constitutional government, but also we know that the pursuit of happiness or happy children are more likely to succeed academically. And so I think that intersection between those foundational beliefs in the pursuit of happiness really tees up this issue well today, Hardin. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So I want to draw this contrast, and we all know that anytime one starts talking the binary, they're missing something important, because I think it's much more complex than that. But one way to start thinking about this conversation is this academic versus social emotional well-being. Obviously, they're connected. Obviously, they work together. But as educational institutions, we tend to organize very well to the academic side of the house. Parents are involved, teachers are involved, we have professional development, principals, district leaderships. We have lots of research about what good academics look like and act like, and how what good curriculum looks like. We have lots of choices, and we have systems that facilitate that process. And so as we address the challenges to academic learning loss, we already have structures that are in place that in many of our great districts in the country and the world will be addressing. We don't have the equivalent when it comes to social emotional well-being. There's no systematic leadership. Whoever's leading in this work will vary school by school, district by district, state by state. Everyone has a conversation about what social emotional well-being looks like. There are lots of good research about it, but as a system, we haven't moved to the point where we address this systematically in a way that we can expect that all our children will have these learning opportunities in schools. And that's a little bit about what we want to set up that conversation today.
So Karen, anything you'd like to add before we jump into our case study?
Sure, I think it's really important because you have teed in on what the real challenge is that we have a bifurcated approach to academic learning and social emotional learning. And we know that for our children to flourish, they need the essential life skills that are typically developed with all of the same stakeholders, all of the same critical people who make a child's academic success successful. You also need them involved in ensuring that they have that social emotional learning and that robust toolkit in which they can flourish not only in the schools, but lifelong. And so I was intrigued when Hardin suggested that we look into this in a bit more detail.
That's an interesting tension that you're bringing up between the fact that we often see these as a binary structure. But Karen, what I heard you say just now, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in order to do them effectively, in order to do both effectively, they need to be braided together more than we might see.
Correct.
Great. All right, so tell us more about this case study.
So, we had in the state of Virginia, our schools were amongst the first to close, and in some cases amongst the last to open for in-person learning for everybody. We did bring back some students earlier on because of the unique needs that they had, be it special education services, children living in poverty, children that were demonstrating that they weren't flourishing in the virtual environment. Subsequent to that, we started looking at the data. We looked at the data in the midst of COVID, and then we pulled on resources that we use every year, which is that in partnership with our Board of Supervisors, Fairfax County actually issues a youth survey. And when we looked at the data for the 2020-2021 school year, we saw some pretty significant areas which we had been watching for a while about our children demonstrating more stress and anxiety, frankly, since the early noughts. But in the post-COVID environment, it became even more startling, for want of a better term. And that is that when you see 17.8% of all of our sixth graders reporting stress most or all the time, and that 62, so almost 2/3 of our kids experience it a little bit or some of the time in the past 30 days. We always knew that our girls were experiencing more stress and anxiety than our boys, but we saw it even more so in our sixth graders with the most recent survey. And similarly, what we've seen is an increased number of students who feel like they have been bullied. We actually also saw an increased number of students who felt comfortable bullying others. And so when you look at all of these different pieces of data or the data strands, we recognize that as a school system, we needed to be much more intentional in ensuring the social, emotional, and mental well-being of our students. And so that's when in March of 2023, we were also looking at how our children were were responding in a post-COVID world, and we saw more and more students who were chronically absent, partially because they had been in an environment in which they could participate virtually. They didn't need to turn on their cameras, and they didn't have to actually get out of their house to go to school. Then we saw, not only in Fairfax County, but across the state, that chronic absenteeism had increased substantially from 2 to 4% to, according to the state's superintendents, in March of this year, 25% of our schools in the state of Virginia were facing the challenges of getting kids to come back. We also saw another area in which our students were, and yet again, not unique to Fairfax because it's happening across the country, but we saw that there was an increase in self-medication of students who were taking illicit drugs that hadn't taken them in the past. And there was actually a 60% increase in the number of our students who are not in the state of Virginia, who were who had fatal overdoses, mostly with fentanyl. So when you take all of that together, it's why there needs to be a more intentional approach to addressing the needs of our kids.
So Karen, you mentioned particularly in 2020 and 2021, during that really isolated period that we're seeing these changes with kids. Have we seen that same anxiety persist since then? Do we have the data on that?
We're still waiting for more data, but we have more anecdotal data that our kids are starting to have a sense of normalcy, but it's also because we've been much more intentional in our supports for our kids. And I'll go through a little bit of it. One is that we are doing universal screening for social emotional learning, and that is done twice a year. And as a result of that screening, the data is shared with the parents so that they can have conversations with their kids about what's going on. It's also shared with individuals in their schools who can ensure that we have multiple tiers of support for kids who are facing challenges. We've increased access to our mental and behavioral health services. We have a behavioral intervention specialist at each of our schools. We have mental health training, what they call cognito training for all of our middle and high school students so that they can be more aware of not only if they're facing a crisis, but if they see some of their friends in crises and get help for them. We've instituted a number of focused periods of time to provide curriculum supports to our students, including starting every day in our elementary schools with a morning meeting. And then for our high school and middle school students, we actually have a period built into their schedules, which also it's called an advisory period, where we are pushing in some of these lessons. Because we know that we can't do this alone, we need parents to be our partners in this process. We've posted all of our social emotional learning curriculum online and have resources available to parents, including a parent resource center where they can get additional supports. And then finally, just starting in April, we rolled out a telemental health service, which is available currently for the 68,000 high school students in our district. We're hoping to push it down into middle schools. And it's an opt-in service in which students can get mental health counseling in their native tongue, which is a game changer. And it's free of it. There's no cost to it. What was so surprising about this, in the last data I saw, the first 2 weeks it was rolled out, we were having 55 kids a day sign up for telehealth services. So that demonstrates that this is an area in which kids need the help. And as a public school system that has 182,000 students, we know it's critical to provide those supports to them. So as you can tell, go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen. I was just
No,
going to say,
please.
that it sounds like a very, a very comprehensive and creative set of solutions to increase access from a whole bunch of different angles. Like I heard you talk about a lot of different angles on solving this problem, on providing support to children. So while, Hardin was talking earlier about how, systems of support that are comprehensive in this way are not universal and we don't think about this on a national level, but it seems like throughout Fairfax County, this was done really systematically and thoughtfully.
I would like to say that it has always been done systematically, but it's not. We kind of caught up with ourselves. And the reason we had to catch up with ourselves on this issue was really because the needs were so great in the COVID years, and we were monitoring. Our first response was for the physical needs, and we provided tens of millions of free meals to families that maybe were facing food insecurity. But then we recognized that beyond food insecurity, these were issues that if we didn't address them now and provide the skills, help these kids gain the skills, because you can't provide skills, you can create the environment in which students can hone their skills, that we would be dealing with this for a much longer period of time. We also found, so for example, Hazel, which is our telemental health service, we're not only limiting it to the students, we are actually offering it up to family members as well, because we know that as a society, we need to recognize that we faced, in many cases, a triple trauma associated with COVID. You had the trauma associated with perhaps the loss of a loved one or the loss of a job or food insecurity, but you also had that trauma of the loss of connectivity with other kids and other people in our society, because everybody hunkered down in their own unique places. And although Zoom is a wonderful advent of technology and allowed us to connect with people, it's not the same thing. And so we knew we needed to provide pathways for people to heal, but also to have skills that were lifelong. I mean, prior to COVID, what we were doing is we were doing things like mindfulness exercises, and we were doing things that were much more, for want of a better term, they were one-offs. And then we realized we just needed to be a bit more intentional.
Okay, so jumping back to Lizzie and I and our other presentation for this conference have interviewed a lot of leaders around the country who are youth serving, and they with a focus on equity, and they always think about the barriers. So clearly you've had some great successes and things are responding appropriately to your data. What were some of the barriers that you and your colleagues experienced in trying to implement this multifaceted approach?
I think the biggest barrier was a lack of understanding and by the community of what this is. And we have a crisis in our country of a lack of faith in government going on right now, and constantly questioning. And so there was, by some, a pushback of, wait a second, just focus on the core four. That's all you should be doing, the core four. Don't talk about any of that other stuff, because after all, that's the role of parents. So we recognized that we really needed to bring our parents closer in, even though, typically in our Title I schools, there is a much closer alignment between parents and the education system. In some of our more affluent areas, there's that healthy questioning in some cases, but we needed to ensure that we are not trying to push their children into a way of thinking as much as help their children have the skills to be able to navigate an ever-changing world. And what, it's called social emotional learning, but I also believe these skills are the soft skills that are so critical that to essential life, they're essential life skills.
So
Yeah.
with an eye on the clock, I noticed that we're running out of time for our presentation, and we will have some time for questions, and we'll be, live with you all shortly. But knowing that we only have another minute left on the clock, Hardin, how would you describe the implications of this case for what you were talking about earlier, how the systems don't necessarily exist on a larger national level?
I think one of the reasons that Fairfax County is such a great example is that they really did take a very data-driven approach to this conversation. It wasn't a theoretical narrative or a political narrative. It was saying, here's what we see is happening in our children's lives, and what do we need to do systematically to respond? And that's something that I think more and more districts have to take greater responsibility for, identifying the data they have about the social emotional well-being of their students, starting to track it, create and implement curriculum that drives growth in that area, and then follows that iterative process, as Karen suggested. As they tried in Fairfax to do some work, when it wasn't sufficient, they didn't say, oh, woe is me, we're not being successful. They said, well, what else do we need to do? And what can we do? And where do we start? And how do we grow? And using that data to engage in a continual cycle of improvement. And I believe strongly that if we success, the districts that do that will not only recover well, but they'll also begin to flourish. And as we come into other challenges, which the forest fires in Canada remind us clearly that there are going to be a lot of changes in the world going forward. So creating healthy districts that are focused on social emotional well-being of children and bringing parents in as full partners are ways in which we can flourish. I want to applaud the work at Fairfax and hope that other people come to you to see how it was done and begin to grow this great success.
Well, this is such important work, and it provides so many concrete strategies. I think it's starting to be a national conversation around social emotional learning and how important it is, but it doesn't necessarily feel like many districts know where to start. So what a wonderful comprehensive program to look at and use as a model. So I'm going to stop us here. I think we could talk about all of this for a long time, and turn it over to our audience over in Florence and see if they have any questions that we can answer live online with the few minutes that we might have left.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Lizzie. Thank you, Karen.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right, now I got to figure out how to. Always a way to stop this recording that takes me too long. Doesn't just pop up for me. This is very more than for. There we go. Why am I? Oh, I know. I can just share.
Should be upper left-hand corner.
There we go.
There's some.
Got it.